Imagine a bank auditor walking into a routine financial review, and instead of filing a report, he calls the police, alerts Congress, and tells them the CEO needs to be removed immediately. Except this isn't a bank. This is the United States government, and the auditor is a federal judge. His name is James Boasberg, and what he just did has never happened before in modern American history. Because this wasn't oversight, this was escalation. It started with subpoenas issued by the office of Jeanine Pirro, targeting the Federal Reserve and its chairman, Jerome Powell. On paper, it looked like a criminal probe, a standard legal process, something the public has seen before. But inside the courtroom, under judicial scrutiny, that narrative didn't hold. Judge Boasberg didn't just question the subpoenas, he dismantled them. He wrote in plain terms there was zero evidence of a crime and a mountain of evidence of retaliation. Now pause there, because that line matters. Zero evidence of a crime means the legal foundation doesn't exist. Mountain of retaliation means the motive does, and it points somewhere political. And that's where the name Donald Trump enters the frame, not as a distant figure, but as the center of gravity behind the pressure campaign. Because this wasn't just about documents or testimony, it was about forcing a central bank to bend. According to the record, the pressure wasn't subtle. Public statements demanding lower interest rates, direct criticism of Powell's decisions, a pattern that, in isolation, might look like politics, but when paired with a criminal probe lacking evidence, begins to look like something else entirely, not oversight, not enforcement, but leverage. And here's where the system did something unusual. Instead of letting the case move forward slowly, motions, delays, procedural battles, Judge Boasberg accelerated the outcome. He didn't just block the subpoenas, he took the evidentiary record, the testimony, the documented pattern, and transmitted it directly to Congress. Not as a suggestion, not as commentary, but as a formal signal. That signal carried weight for one reason. It crossed a line that has held for over 2 centuries. Judges interpret the law, Congress handles impeachment. Those roles are separate by design. But in this case, the separation didn't hold, because the judge concluded the timeline itself was the threat. And Congress responded accordingly. No drawn-out hearings, no procedural hesitation. Within hours, momentum built toward a 72-hour window, an accelerated path to impeachment backed by over 220 co-sponsors. That number matters because it's not theoretical, it's a majority, which means the outcome in the House is no longer a question of if, but when. So what you're watching unfold isn't a normal political dispute. It's not a routine investigation, and it's not just another headline cycle. This is a moment where one branch of government looked at the evidence and decided the standard pace of justice was too slow for the risk, too slow for the damage, and too slow for what they believed was already happening in real time. And when a system designed to move slowly suddenly accelerates, that tells you something broke long before the headlines caught up. Because here's the part that doesn't get said out loud, at least not directly. If this were a normal legal process, the evidence would stay in court, the arguments would unfold over months, and Congress would wait its turn. That's how the system protects itself from politics, but that's not what happened here. The evidence didn't stay contained. It moved fast, and it moved with purpose. What Judge James Boasberg did was not just procedural, it was interpretive. He looked at the pattern, subpoenas without a crime, pressure without legal grounding, escalation without justification. And instead of treating those as separate anomalies, he connected them. He treated them as a single chain of intent. That's not speculation. That's how judicial reasoning works when facts align too cleanly to ignore. Now look at the logic from the other side. If the subpoenas were legitimate, where is the underlying offense? If the investigation was neutral, why does it collapse under basic evidentiary review? And if this was just routine oversight, why did it require targeting the sitting chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, at the exact moment policy disagreements were escalating? These aren't rhetorical questions anymore. They're contradictions. Because the timeline matters. Public pressure from Donald Trump demanding lower interest rates didn't exist in a vacuum. It coincided with the legal action. It paralleled the subpoenas. And when those subpoenas failed, the explanation wasn't procedural, it was structural. The case didn't just weaken, it collapsed. And collapse leaves a vacuum, one that the system has to fill with an explanation. Judge Boasberg filled it with 2 phrases that now define the entire record: zero evidence of a crime, and a mountain of evidence of retaliation. Those are not casual observations, those are judicial findings grounded in what was presented, what was tested, and what did not survive scrutiny. So now we enter prosecutorial mode, because this is where the narrative either holds or breaks. Receipt 1. The subpoenas themselves, grand jury authority invoked without a sustainable criminal predicate. Receipt 2. The target, Jerome Powell, not a peripheral actor, but the head of an independent institution whose decisions directly contradict political pressure. Receipt 3. The ruling, issued by a federal judge who didn't just question intent but identified a pattern of retaliation. Stack those together, and the logic compresses. Either this was a lawful investigation that somehow forgot to include a crime, or it was something else entirely, something designed to look like law while functioning as pressure. There isn't a third option that survives contact with the facts. And here's the contradiction that becomes impossible to ignore. The system relies on the idea that law is neutral, that it applies upward as easily as it applies downward. But if the tools of that system, subpoenas, investigations, prosecutorial authority, can be redirected without evidence, then the neutrality isn't just weakened, it's conditional. Which brings us back to why the timeline accelerated. Because once neutrality becomes conditional, delay becomes dangerous. Every hour spent pretending the process is normal is an hour the process can be used again. That's the risk Judge Boasberg identified, and that's why the response didn't wait. Congress didn't interpret the signal slowly. It treated it like an alarm, and alarms don't come with debates. They come with countdowns. And countdowns don't just measure time, they measure pressure. Because once Congress received that evidentiary record, the conversation inside Washington changed almost instantly. This was no longer about optics, messaging, or party positioning. It became a math problem. 220 co-sponsors already on record, a simple majority already secured before the debate even began. That number matters more than any speech because it removes uncertainty. You don't negotiate when the votes already exist. You don't delay when delay only benefits the target. And you don't pretend neutrality when the system itself has already signaled escalation. So the House moved, fast. Not because speed looks strong, but because speed prevents interference. Because every additional day creates space for pressure, for influence, for the same mechanisms that triggered this crisis to activate again. And that's the part no one says directly. The clock isn't just ticking forward, it's closing windows. Now shift your focus to the Senate, because that's where the story either resolves or fractures further. Conviction requires 67 votes. That means at least 17 Republicans would have to cross the line. And historically, that's where impeachment efforts die. But something is different this time, and it's not subtle. Names that were once predictable are no longer stable. Tom Tillis begins to distance. Thomas Massie signals hesitation. These are not symbolic figures. These are structural supports. And when structural supports shift, the system doesn't wobble, it rebalances. Because other lawmakers are watching the same record, reading the same judicial findings, and asking the same question in private. Can you defend this without contradicting the evidence? That's the trap, not a political trap, but a logical one. Because to defend the action, you have to justify the subpoenas. To justify the subpoenas, you need a crime, and the court already established there wasn't one. So what remains is motive, and motive, when documented and repeated, stops being speculation. It becomes pattern, and patterns are what juries convict on. Now bring this out of Washington for a second and make it real. Imagine you're an ordinary business owner. You refuse to make a decision that benefits someone powerful. Days later, investigators show up, not with evidence, but with authority. They dig, they question, they escalate. And then a judge steps in and says, "There was never a case here to begin with." That's not oversight, that's pressure. And when people see that dynamic at the highest level of government, it doesn't stay abstract. It translates into something immediate. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. That's the moral fracture point. Not left versus right, not party versus party, but power versus limit. Because the entire system depends on one assumption. That power stops where the law begins. And this case flips that assumption on its head. If power can initiate legal action without evidence, if it can sustain that action long enough to create real pressure, and if the correction only comes after intervention at the highest judicial level, then the system didn't fail at the end. It failed at the beginning. That's why the response now feels disproportionate to some observers. 72 hours, National Guard presence, a Capitol on alert, It looks extreme until you understand what's being contained. Because this isn't about removing a president as punishment, it's about restoring a boundary that was already crossed. Because once a boundary like that is crossed, the danger isn't the single act, it's the precedent it creates. And precedent spreads faster than any investigation ever could. It becomes a template, a signal to every future actor watching from the sidelines. This is how far you can push. This is how long you can operate. This is how the system responds. That's why what happens next matters more than what already happened, because correction, if it comes, has to be unmistakable. Now step back into the chamber where this all converges, the Senate, not as a stage for speeches, but as a courtroom in everything but name, evidence already tested in front of a federal judge, findings already written into the record, and a question that no senator can avoid, no matter how carefully they phrase their vote. Do you accept the conclusion reached by James Boasberg, or do you reject it? Do you treat zero evidence of a crime and a mountain of evidence of retaliation as binding reality, or as inconvenient noise? Because neutrality is no longer an option once the evidence is fixed. Silence becomes a position, delay becomes a decision. And here's the part that sharpens into something harder than politics. Every senator understands the arithmetic, 67 votes for conviction. They also understand the optics. Breaking ranks carries a cost. But what they're really weighing isn't political survival, it's whether ignoring a judicial record is still defensible once it's been laid out in full. This is where the moral contrast stops being abstract. On one side, institutional power, subpoenas, investigations, authority invoked without a sustainable legal basis. On the other, the public, people who rely on the assumption that those tools can't be turned arbitrarily against them. If that assumption collapses, the distance between high office and ordinary life disappears faster than anyone expects. Because the story people will remember isn't the procedural detail, it's the image, a central bank chair pressured through legal force, a court stepping in to halt it, and a government forced to react at emergency speed. That image carries consequences. It reshapes trust, and once trust shifts, it doesn't reset easily. So strip this down to its core, without labels, without party lines. A legal mechanism was activated without evidence. A judge intervened and documented why. Congress accelerated to respond, and now the system is asking itself, in real time, whether it will enforce its own limits. Because if it doesn't, if the conclusion is acknowledged but not acted upon, then the message is just as clear as any conviction, that the rules exist, but only until they become inconvenient, that the boundary exists, but only until someone powerful decides to test it, and that enforcement is optional. So here's the question that remains when everything else is stripped away, the one that doesn't go away after the vote, after the trial, after the headlines fade. What is the law, if it bends the moment power leans on it? If you've been following this breakdown, hit like so more people see it. Drop your take in the comments. I want to know where you stand when the evidence is this clear. Share this with someone who still thinks this is just politics. And subscribe, because this story isn't over, and the next move will matter even more.